Hello. In this video, I'm going to be demonstrating to you how to use API Manager to provide policies to your Mule APIs. So, before anything, you will need to, of course, have a Mule application designed to use API Kit. So I've got one here. There's an API Kit router. There's a RAML. So, of course, this RAML needs to be created in anypoint. So you'll have the design center, and you'll see test app, and here's where I've created my RAML. Your RAML will have to be published in Exchange before you can use API Manager. So in this case, I've already done it. So you see current version 1.0.0. So if you come here and see, you can see that's already there, version, etc. So let's go back. So my API is ready now to integrate with anypoint. So the first thing you need to do is add this API auto discovery. So this will need to point to whatever is your main router flow, and it will need to indicate the API ID. Now the API ID in Mule 4 is different from Mule 3. In Mule 3, it was in a way easier because you could just put your API name and that's all you would need, and you would know that in advance. In Mule 4, that API ID is generated by anypoint, so you don't know it in advance. You need to have provisioned it, and then you need to put it in there. But to make things even more complicated, that API ID will change in every environment. So you can't hard code that value. It needs to be a parameter that you will override in every environment. So here I've created API.id, and if you look at my config file, there's an API.id. So now to start creating the API, let's go to API Manager. So as you can see, I've already got one pre-existing API defined. This API has a client ID and secret policy. So in order to access it, it needs to get a client ID. It needs to have that client ID and secret to be approved to access the API. So I'm going to do manage API from Exchange, and then find my API, and then just fill in the rest. Pretty easy. And since we're talking Mule 4, this needs to be checked in, very important. So now I can just save, and my API is created. So now that it's created, I have the API ID. So this number here is the API ID, and I'm going to put it in my project. That's actually important in Mule 4. If you're familiar with Mule 3, you'll know that when you run your application in your browser, it doesn't really matter what the API Manager is doing because it's automatically turned off. So API Manager does not do anything when you run it locally on your IDE. Mule 4 has changed that completely. It's the inverse. So Mule 4 will run policies in your local application in the exact same way that they would be on production or test environments, etc. So that was a design decision by MuleSoft. I asked what's going on, why is it changed, and they said specifically yes, it was a decision they took. It's double-edged, but yeah, it is what it is. So now that I have the API ID in my application, I'm going to want to add some policies. So let's just say I also want client ID and secret so that only authorized people can access my API. So I'm going to do apply new policy, client ID enforcement, configure, default fine. Okay, so now I have a policy, so anytime someone wants to access the API, it will have to provide authentication. Now, let's just say that my API needs to access other APIs, like this one, for example. So this will be actually a very typical scenario with an API-led architecture, where you have multiple layers: experience, process, system. So the experience will access one or more process APIs, and each process API will access one or more system APIs. So your one front API could actually be calling two others, or no, 10 others or 20 other APIs. So of course, you need to request access to all those different APIs. So in this case, I'm only going to access one, which is other API. So to do that, I'm going to go to Exchange. I'm going to do to other API, and I'm going to request access. So I'm going to create an application. So client application is the terminology they use. So a client application could be a Mule API, but it could be some other random client. So it could be a third-party vendor, and you create a client application for that third-party vendor. Now, those client application names aren't namespace to the environment. So if you have one client application per environment, which is pretty typical, you need to make sure the names don't clash. So I'm going to call this test app-sandbox. That way it doesn't clash. And now I'm going to say my API needs to access the sandbox instance, because my API is a sandbox API. And voilà. So now it generated the client ID and secret, which my API will need to access. So I'll copy this. And now I'm ready. So now I could do the same thing with other APIs. So request access, it gets approved. Now in this case, the only advantage is the client ID and secret stays the same. So I don't have to keep copying that for every API, but I do need to go and do request access for every single API. If there's 10 times. So that's pretty much all you need to do for your first environment. So typically dev, sandbox, whatever you call it. Now, in any kind of continuous deployment environment, so where you have multiple, so like QA, UAT, pre-prod, so you'll need to promote your API through all those different environments. So you could have two, you could just have sandbox and prod, like in my example, or you could have 10. It will vary on the organization and testing processes of the organization. So in my case, I'm going to promote this API to production. So let's go to API Manager. So here I'm going to change this to production environment. So I could repeat the same steps I did earlier. So manage API from Exchange and then fill in everything. But I have this promote for environment will save me a bit of work. So I can just come here and say sandbox, my API is test API, v1, and then it will automatically copy the policies, the SLAs, the alerts, and the API configurations. Now, this promote is nice. However, keep in mind that it's a one-off. So if you needed to later on go and add a policy, you can't promote the policy. You will have to go and change it in every single environment. So let's just say I want to add. So first let's look at the policies here. So as you see, there's client ID enforcement, and if I went to sandbox and I went to my API, so let's add header injection. World mouse. So now there's no way for these to get automatically promoted to prod. So I will then have to go to prod and go into my API, go to the policy, apply new policy, header injection, and same thing, world earth, for example. So the promote saves you a little bit of work, but not that much in the long term, not for changes, fundamentally. So now the same thing. So also this doesn't promote access that has been granted. So I'm going to have to go again, ask access for every single API I need to access and create a new client application. So let's go to Exchange. Let's go to other API. Now I'm going to need to again request access. So here I need a new client application. So test app-prod. And now this is the prod app. So I want to be able to access the prod other API. Now in this case, also there is an SLA tier. So this SLA tier basically says that maximum of 1 request per millisecond. And also it requires manual approval. So I'm going to have to go to an extra step to actually approve it. So request API pending approval. So now you need to go to the API manager. You'll need to go to other API. You'll need to go to contracts, and then you'll see the contract requesting, test prod, and then approve. So now it will work. So you'll need to then go to go to client applications, and here you will be now able to see your client ID and secret. So now to deploy this in production, you will need to override those 3 values for the production environment, or for any environment. So every single environment you deploy to, those 3 values will be different. Now, how you do that will depend on if you're doing on-prem or Cloud Hub. So Cloud Hub has an easy mechanism to override properties. So I'll show. So you go deploy to Cloud Hub, select prod, and now in here I can override all the properties. Now on-prem, there's no such thing provided by anypoint. So it's however you've done your configuration management. So if, for example, you're reading files from the server, you might have to SSH to the server and go modify a file, for example. So I'm going to now put all the right values. So I need the API ID for that environment, which is, let's go back to test app. So it's this number. So this number is different in prod than in test or in sandbox. And my client ID and secrets will be different. So api.client.id equals manager, client application, pro. So it's this value, and now this application is ready to deploy. Of course, if there's more APIs that you need to be grant access, you'll need to go and click, grant access. And if it requires approval, go and approve. So lots of clicking. In an API-led approach architecture, you need to be really careful not to make mistakes. Because if you make any mistake, you will generally only find out when you're testing. And all you'll see is you're calling an API and it fails, but you won't really know why it failed. So it could be that you've made a mistake in one of the other APIs that API is calling. So you can end up spending a lot of time just trying to figure out to find, you did a copy pasted the wrong value in 1 out of 10 APIs, and you could easily spend, depending on what tools you have, a lot of time trying to figure that out. So that's basically the whole process on how to use API Manager. As you can see, it is rather painful at scale. If you've got, say, 10 APIs, 50 APIs, you're going to spend a lot of time here clicking and making mistakes and troubleshooting it. It's really not a good idea to do this manually at scale. So you really want to automate this, and for that, you will need to look at my next video where I'll demonstrate how to automate this whole process. And hopefully you will never have to actually do what I've demonstrated to you.